So I'm Josh Peterson. I'm in professional services at Esri, which means that I do a lot of application building. I'm a web developer in our Denver office.
And I'm Gavin Rehkemper, about the same, professional services web developer.
And I wanted to point out that the slides are online. The link is here, and we'll show it again later. Our thoughts here were to kind of race through a lot of things and show you a lot of things, but also give you the links to the slides so you can come back and do some more digging at a deeper level. So there are lots of hyperlinks and launch points to go and find out more about the tools that we're going to share, but we're not going to go super deep on anything today. So Jeff Jackson from the apps team kind of stole our thunder and did the top 10 list during plenary, but we've got kind of our own top 10 list here. We cheated a few times, but Gavin and I put together sort of 10 categories of tools and then picked out some of our favorites to share with you guys. We're going to try and sort of show you what each one is, how it makes our lives easier, how it's sort of an integral part of our daily workflows, and then again, be kind of a launch point where you can go and find more information and discover how it might help you out. So I'm going to jump into our first category here. So our first category of tools is source code management. And my favorite source code management tool is GitHub. So GitHub is a website, right? Does anybody not use GitHub in here, or has not used? Okay, cool. So I would recommend to check it out, even if you're like the only developer in your shop, or if you just work with a lot of PMs or sales or whatever. It's not just for sharing code; it's for collaborating on projects, really. It helps from the planning process to the development process through to the release process, and can integrate with lots of other tools to help you along those different parts of your workflow. And the central sort of core of why I think GitHub is so great is this flow of how you actually write applications. There's this concept called Git flow. There are different flavors of it. GitHub flow is the GitHub flavor of it. But all at their core, this is kind of the most concise diagram I think there is. And if I go from the bottom up here, each one of these rows on this graph is a branch of code. The bottom are the feature branches where you're writing your code and making commits often, right? And then the purple level is the develop branch. So that's kind of where the entire development team, if you have a team, is merging all their code together and sort of collaborating at that level, and that's kind of the living version of your application. And then the blue at the top is the master branch, or the sort of the always releasable version of your application, right? From the initial release all the way on, any time that code gets merged into master, it should be releasable in an ideal world. And all of the links between these branches are done via pull requests in the Git flow workflow. And pull requests are a place where you can, it's sort of a living collaboration space for a chunk of code or a feature of code. And that allows for communication between the development team as well as from your management staff or your QA staff, and allows for deep code reviews too if you wanted to do that. If you haven't gone to the guides.github.com page, even if you use GitHub on a daily basis, I would recommend doing so. The first one, understanding the GitHub flow, goes a little bit more in depth about that last slide. But there are lots of others as well. Even if you were not a developer and you just wanted to understand better how to communicate with a project on GitHub, there are some guides here for documenting and mastering Markdown, which is a markup language, and other things like that as well. So that's GitHub, the place where you put your Git repositories. And Gavin's going to talk a little bit about his favorite tool for using Git as code management.
Switch me. Yeah, so our favorite, so I use Git commands in the command line when I need to, but when I'm on my home machine on Windows managing code, I find is much easier to use a graphical tool. And the one that both Josh and I use is SourceTree. So let's just jump into SourceTree. SourceTree is a cross-platform app. It was built for Mac, so it looks a little bit better on Mac, but it also works great on Windows as well. On the left-hand side, there's folders and entries for you to pull up all of your most used Git repositories. And on the right-hand side, there's a tabbed user interface where you can see all your repositories. On the left-hand side of this area, it shows your branches, your tags, your remotes, all the important stuff. And the key piece, what's valuable about a graphical tool is this commits and the graph area here. So I can easily see in this column of dots that here was a branch, here someone worked on a branch, and here was a merge back into the code. So it's really important on projects where you have lots of people working on many different branches to see where the code is going and where it's coming from. Additional benefits of kind of having a visual tool is that on each commit, when I click into it, I can see the files, I can see a diff of what exactly changed in that commit, in that particular file. You can obviously do the standard stuff, push, pull, commit, etc. SourceTree understands Git flow if your team is following that paradigm. And of course, a GUI tool can't do everything that Git can possibly do. Sometimes you have to, if you're in a complex situation, you have to get into the command line, so you can launch the command line super easy from SourceTree. So that's our favorite tool. SourceTree can be found at sourcetreeapp.com. If you're on Windows, you might also look into GitKraken and Git Tower, because those are kind of cool tools on the block that I think may become bigger in 2017. Our next tool is actually podcasts. So podcasts are a great way to learn and stay up to date on the latest web development technologies and news. So we thought we'd share with you a couple of our favorites. Mine is the SitePen podcast. This is one podcast that I've started listening to over the past year. You might think that it being SitePen, all they do is go into deep delves of Dojo, but you'd be wrong about that. They actually talk about web development, they talk about JavaScript, from frameworks to Webpack, React, Angular, even about virtual reality. So it's a great thing to listen to. Some of my favorite episodes are, if you want to go into the back catalog, episode 17, live from Nebraska JS Conference. They talked to some of the presenters from there. Episode 16, they talked about ES 2015 versus AMD and the challenges with JavaScript loaders right now. It really helped me understand that problem and where we're going there. And an older episode, episode 11, they talk about Flux, React, and Redux. You can find that on iTunes or really any podcast catcher.
Yeah, so my podcast that I chose for this one, if I'd done this last year, it probably would have been JS Jabber, which was is still a really good podcast. It's really in-depth, and they have these hour-long episodes that are good, but sort of difficult to digest on a commute or something like that, and that's usually when I'm listening to these. So Tools Day is a newer podcast from Chris Donaraj and Una Kravitz. They both, Chris still works on the IBM Bluemix team. Una used to, she now works at DigitalOcean. So they do a lot of the same things that I do, and that a lot of us do as web developers. Una also does has been doing a lot more conference talks and things like that, so you may have come across her in that spectrum as well. Again, these are links, so if you wanted to come back here and click out to one of these episodes, these are kind of the four that I would recommend to start with. So that one was kind of soft. Let's go into terminals now. That's our next category. How many people here use a Mac? Okay, I'm assuming the rest use Windows, or Linux, or Unix. Okay, there we go. All right, so I use a Mac, so I'm going to talk on the Mac/Unix side, and then Gavin's going to talk a little bit about Windows. So I think that your shell setup and your shell environment you should treat it a little bit like your text editor or your IDE. It should be pleasing for you to use, because it can be a little bit daunting, especially for web developers who don't sort of live in their terminal all the time. So for me, on my Mac, ZSH is an alternative to Bash, which is the out-of-the-box shell for Mac. And then there are a few other tools here that are mostly plugins or add-ons or themes that go along with that to make me smile when I look at my terminal, right? The last one there on the left is dot files. That's kind of generic, but dot files are individual files that allow you to configure your shell environment. whether that's setting up aliases or functions or more UI theme type things as well. Rather than sharing mine, I would just point you to Paul Irish's. Paul Irish works for Google. He has like the mecca of dot files in a GitHub repository, so Google Paul Irish dot files and it'll come up. So I'm going to do a couple of quick demos here of my terminal. So this is Hyper. I used to use iTerm, which is another great shell sort of application. Hyper is an Electron app, similar to Atom. So it's all very themable and customizable and all that kind of stuff that we web developers like. So the first thing I'm going to show off is sort of the auto completion, right? So if I'm just in my root directory and I just try to cd, this is a feature of ZSH, and you can see that there's just a much nicer way to sort of traverse and figure out what's going on in your the directory that you're working on. So if I go into my node directory, which is where I've got all my applications, I'm going to go into my apps, and then the next thing is let me go into a project here. Crowdsource reporter, which I've been working on here. The next thing, it might be kind of hard to see. Let me zoom in there. And it's kind of dark anyway, but next to crowdsource reporter, you can see that it says master. So ZSH has recognized that I'm in a Git repository right now, and it's telling me what branch I'm on. And if I had local changes that hadn't been committed, it would give me some indication of those changes as well. You can also ZSH can also correct your spelling. So my biggest spelling mistake in the terminal is always when I'm trying to create new directories. And you can see that ZSH it knows that I meant to type MDKIR instead of MKDIR, other way around there. And a simple Y, we'll go ahead and execute that command, and we can see that my test has been created. Also, you can see here when I do an ls to list the contents of that directory, they're color coded, right? So it's just that quick like micro interaction of visually being able to tell which ones are folders versus files. When you repeat this process day and day and day, it adds up to a lot of time. So we can also do that with git commands. So I'm in a git repository, so just typing git and then tab, you can see I'm actually getting all of the auto completions for the git command, along with some descriptions of what those commands actually do. The last one I wanted to show are aliases. So this is not specific to Bash or ZSH or anything else, but setting up aliases can really help you navigate through your directory structure faster, or kick off processes, or do anything like that. So I've got one called getPretty. Again, this comes from Paul Irish, but it basically is a git command that has like 12 different flags on the command, but instead of having to type that every time, I just type it once, alias it to getPretty and type it once, and it gives me the commit history of my current branch in my repository, along with an actual graph, right? And then the last one that I wanted to show is Web App Builder, right? So I have an alias for Web App Builder that's just web. It knows where my Web App Builder is installed. It kind of goes back to the root and finds Web App Builder and kicks off my Web App Builder. So it's now running in my browser. So if you're doing Web App Builder development, you don't have to hunt around for the directory where it's at and kick off server.js manually every single time. So it's another useful tool there. And we'll go back to Gavin here now.
So on the Windows side, how many of us have used Windows command line recently? Oh gosh, please stop. It's so horrible. It's hard to copy and paste in and out of it. Like traditional commands like ls or more don't work very well. Sometimes git doesn't work very well. So that's why our top Windows shell for this year is Commander, spelled CMDER. It's basically Windows PowerShell, but with a better looking UI and a few extras and shortcuts that you can use. So let's jump right into it. So this is Commander. Like I said, the first nice feature is that instead of dir, traditional ls works. My hard drive's still spinning up, sorry about that. So ls works, I promise. And it also has a bunch of settings. So if you jump into the settings here, you can, my favorite, most visual is, the colors. It's got a ton of great themes. It's got transparency built in. It's got a lot of configuration that you can do, from status bars to showing the time to showing your even your CPU temperature if you like that. It's got integrations with other services like Git integration, like Josh was showing on his, and it's got macros. It's got a lot of stuff. Really encourage you to check it out. You can also do aliases, so if you just set those up inline. If you do alias, you can set those up. I've got LL set up to basically alias ls and show the list view of a directory with a human readable version of the size of the files. So that's really nice as well. So Commander is free, and you can download that at cmder.net. So our next tool is actually social media. So the web development world, I think we know, is rapidly changing these days. New tools and technologies are being released all the time. To be able to be informed but not overwhelmed is a skill unto itself. And we found that finding the right news sources, specifically the right places to follow on social media to get good information, is a great way to avoid JavaScript fatigue, but also kind of web development fatigue. Talking to Twitter, Twitter's one of those news sources that I use. My first follow that I think that I would recommend is the David Walsh blog. David Walsh works at Mozilla. I believe he used to work at SitePen. He has a great blog about a lot of JavaScript topics, and his Twitter feed posts out those blog posts as well as some great web development tips. Next is Brendan Eich, none other than the creator of JavaScript. He's moved on to other ventures, so he tweets about JavaScript, but also just web development in general and the technology world in general. Troy Hunt is security focused. Side note, he runs haveibeenpwned.com, which if you haven't been there, you should. You put in your username and you can find out if your account has been released in one of these big data breaches. But anyway, he tweets about security, which I think is really important for us as web developers to at least have a handle on a little bit this day and age. So Troy Hunt is his Twitter account. I don't get all of my news from Twitter. Two other great sources are the JavaScript Reddit. On there you can see how many votes up and down a story gets, so you can tell like if something is really popular, maybe that's something you want to talk about or pay attention to, where if it's not, maybe you can ignore it. And the JavaScript Weekly, I think the JavaScript Weekly is an email newsletter. If email is more your jam, it sends out an email with the biggest JavaScript news stories once a week, and I think it's really popular and really helpful for me to stay abreast of the news. The company that runs that also has some great other email newsletters like the front-end development, Node.js, Postgres, etc. So definitely check that out if you're interested.
I do get all my news from Twitter, so I don't really do the newsletters and things. So my top 5 people to follow on Twitter, the first 2 here, Addy and Paul, are Googlers. They've had a hand in lots of the enhancements of Chrome DevTools. Addy worked on Yeoman and Grunt and some other projects. They talk a lot about frameworks and module patterns and things like that, and a lot of tooling, especially from Paul Irish. Una Kravitz, I mentioned Tools Day earlier. She's one of the co-hosts there. She's a little more on the side of, she talks about the aesthetics and accessibility of the web. So she doesn't tweet out a lot of code snippets per se, but she talks about a lot of really interesting concepts. Dan Abramov, so I'm guilty as a sort of a React guy right now. Most of my work is in React, and Dan works for Facebook. He's kind of their top evangelist for React. He also kind of rewrote the entire React docs. Did a really good job at that, and he's kind of in the Webpack and other sort of scene as well. And then the last one, Wes Boss, is this guy that I didn't know about. I sort of just recently found out about him. He's self-described as a teacher of the web, right? So he's kind of an entrepreneur. He did a lot of WordPress development back in the day, but he puts out a lot of really, really good content. He's actually got courses that you can take, or that you can, he's sort of like pre-recorded videos and put a lot of time into those, and those are things you can pay for. But he's also he puts out articles and blogs and tweets all the time with really cool tidbits about ES6 a lot right now. One of his recent really cool projects was called JavaScript 30. It was kind of trending on Twitter for a while. It was a video tutorial series where he sort of challenged people to build 30 cool things in 30 days without frameworks, which is kind of cool. So it really highlighted a lot of the sort of the browser APIs and features of JavaScript without using a framework as a crutch. And so I actually learned quite a bit from that. All right, onto another real tool here, Debugging Tools. So my favorite debugging tool is Chrome DevTools. So this is the 4th year that I've given a talk about web dev tools here, and Chrome DevTools is like the one that's kind of stuck with every one of those talks, every iteration of those talks. It is sort of the place to go if you need to debug your web applications, right? It is sort of the replacement for anybody who's coming from .NET or Java and has the big beefy IDE that does a lot of your debugging for you. And then you open up Atom or Sublime Text and you're like, where are my debugging tools? They're in Chrome DevTools, and that's where you should look for them. So I'm just going to highlight a couple kind of cool features of Chrome DevTools that I sort of use in a GIS sense when I'm working on maps and stuff. So I've got the just ArcGIS Online, the map viewer open here, and I wanted to show you some of the one of the emulation tools that you can use. So if they've kind of moved them around a lot all the time. So right now, there's this drawer down at the bottom here, and if you're on any of your tabs, you can hit escape to open up that drawer. And then there's the 3 little dots here that take you to all of the cool things that are in DevTools, really. So the sensors panel, let me pull this over, lets you do some cool emulation of things like device orientation and geolocation. So I'm going to just hit the locate me button. Oh no. That's okay. That's because all right. Let me refresh the page here. Let's let Dojo refresh here. Okay, there we go. So I'm gonna hit the locate me button and it's still not gonna work. All right. I don't know what's going on there. Okay, so it works when I'm like emulating it. So it should have taken us to Palm Springs, right? Because I'm connected to Wi-Fi, and HTML5's geolocation API knows that I'm connected to Wi-Fi in the Palm Springs Convention Center, and it should have taken us to Palm Springs. But by changing these, I just use one of the presets over here, and you can use a custom location as well and enter a lat long. You can actually tell it, and it looks like it got a really precise location there, but if we zoom out a bit, you can see that we're in the middle of London. And we can change that preset to any of these or set it to our own custom location and sort of trick the browser into thinking that we're in different places. And this is really useful, right, because you don't want to have to like physically move your laptop if you're testing a geolocation feature in your application. Also really useful is that you can, which is what you saw first, is that you can actually tell it that the device doesn't support geolocation for whatever reason. So you actually have a way to test that error case in your application if the user doesn't have geolocation turned on. The one other thing, this one's a little bit more in the weeds here, but that I wanted to show you is that I've got this application. It's showing a bunch of bird sightings over the last 30 days. And what I wanted to sort of highlight here is the console API. So in Chrome and Firefox and Edge, there's a whole API around the console, right? So we've all used console.log, maybe console.dir or console.error. Console.table is the one I kind of wanted to show off here. So the first thing I'm going to do actually is just log this graphics layer that I've got. And if you've worked with feature layers, you know that this is a really crappy way to investigate your data or to sort of browse any sort of data in a layer, because it's all nested in an array of objects, and each one of those objects has a bunch of different sub-properties, and you have to kind of figure out where the attributes are. So the first thing I'm going to do to flatten that out a little bit is just run it through a map function and sort of lift up those attributes so that my array of objects is like one level more shallow. And so that makes it a little bit better, right? I can just kind of go into each object and look at the attributes, but it's still not a great way if I want to just peruse the data. And so this is where console.table is pretty cool. I'm just going to console.table that, and what we're console.tabling is an array of objects, right? Which is kind of a tabular structure of data, and it's going to turn it into a table for us. And now I can see all 215 of those records and sort of get an immediate view into my data. whether I want to, and you can even do things like sorting, right? So I could sort by which ones of these sightings have been reviewed, and get a quick sort of visual count of the fact that most of these haven't been reviewed. So there's way more to DevTools. Obviously, those are just kind of two cool things that I use in a GIS sense, particularly. The Chrome DevTools documentation is excellent. Definitely go there to start with if you want to deep dive into it. Code School also a couple years ago now put out a class or a course called Discover DevTools in conjunction with the Chrome DevTools team. It's a couple years old now, so it maybe things have moved around in the interface, but it gives you a really good primer on sort of what are the features of DevTools and how you can find them. And now Gavin's going to talk about Postman. We had to fight over this one because I wanted to use it too.
So as web developers, especially GIS web developers, we're always sending off HTTP requests, be it GETs or POSTs, either to ArcGIS Online or custom REST endpoints or what have you. Postman allows you to easily send these requests as part of your development workflow, and also does a ton more. So let's jump into it. For this demo, I'm going to be using a hosted feature service as my REST endpoint. And let's just act, in St. Louis, I grabbed this bat population sightings layer. They've been kind of tracking these in St. Louis. And let's say we have a third-party JavaScript application that we want to integrate into our system. So that in that system, when a bat sighting is added, it automatically gets added to our hosted feature service. Well, Postman can help us with this. So Postman looks like this, and you've got a left-hand sidebar here that has a bunch of saved HTTP requests that you've saved over time. In this case, I just have one. On the right-hand side, there's a tabbed interface, each one representing an HTTP request that you're building and that you can run. So you'll see here I've got a single query. I can choose what type of HTTP request I want to send out, either GET, POST, all these different types. You put in the basic URL, including the parameters, but there's a nice way to view these parameters. So you can see that in this hosted feature service, I'm just doing a standard 1 = 1 query and getting all the fields. So I can send that off, and it shows me the response right below it. Postman has a great way to format all these things. So I know this is JSON, so I'm going to choose JSON. And it's got a great viewer built in. I can click the minus arrow here and see all my features. And so that looks like legit data, right? I'm hitting a feature service and it's responding back. That's pretty cool, right? But not, I could also do that in the browser. But if I want to, for my web application, I actually want to add features to our hosted feature service. So to figure out how to build that request, I could go to the ArcGIS Online REST API documentation and kind of build it from scratch, but Postman makes that a lot easier using Interceptor. So Interceptor is a tool where you enable it here, and you also install a Chrome plugin. So I'll turn it on here, and it basically grabs all of the requests that are going through your browser, similar to the Chrome DevTools network tab, right? But instead, it's going to take all those requests and send them over to Postman so that you can inspect them there. It's kind of like the network tab on steroids. So in this case, I'm going to turn on Interceptor, and I'm only going to grab stuff that starts with arcgis.com, and I'll close that. So immediately, if I pan around the map here, I'll see in my Postman over here that I'm getting a lot of requests. I'm grabbing those all, and I can see the URL. I can even resend that and see what's happening there in the browser. So that's cool. But let's grab an ad. So all I have to do is I'll clear these out, and I'll switch over to ArcGIS Online and do an ad. I'll place a bat sighting in Forest Park here. And immediately I can see I've got a bunch of gets because I moved the map, but here's the post. And so if I look at this post, it's doing apply edits. I think that's what I want. Let's look into the body. And it looks like it's doing an ads call, and it's passing the geometry in Web Mercator. So yeah, that looks like it's what I want to do. I can also resend this ad, so let me change the geometry a little bit and resend that. And you'll see that it's sent out. It created a new feature with object ID 75. And if I close out of this and move around a little bit, we'll see that that point has shown up in ArcGIS Online in our hosted feature service. Okay, that's great. So let me save that. So now I can save that to my collections area for later use. And so now I've kind of got shortcuts to the query and the add. But if I'm doing some development, I'm going to do a bunch of adds. I want to make sure I can clean up after myself in the hosted feature service. So let's grab a delete as well. So I'll go ahead and go in here and just delete that feature that I just created. Go to my history, grab the post, verify it is what I want. Here's an apply edits in the body. Here's the delete for that 75, object ID 75, which is what I just created. And I will save that as a delete. Okay, so that's all great. I can run these back to back. I can add, I can delete. But we have a problem here because if I do an add, I see it created with a feature with object ID 76, but if I switch over to the delete, it still says 75 here, right? I have to manually type that in every single time I want to do testing. I'm a lazy developer. I don't want to do that every single time. So Postman has a solution for that. It's called environmental variables. So let me grab a snippet here. I can go in Postman. I'm going to go into the add request and go to this test tab. And in the test tab, I can set environmental variables. So in this case, I am basically using JavaScript to parse the request that I'm getting back, and I'm placing that into a variable. And I'm using this Postman variable that Postman's providing to me to set an environmental variable called object ID. And I'm just then telling it which part of the response that's coming back from ArcGIS Online I want to grab, which is the add results. I'm grabbing the first result and the object ID. So if I send this now, it's going to send its object ID 77. And when I switch over to the delete, instead of having this hard-coded as 75, I can use a templating language. Just put in object ID like this in curly brackets. That's telling Postman that that's an environmental variable. I'll save it, send it, and we can see that right there, the object ID 77 automatically was deleted without me having to type that in manually, which is great. So now that I've kind of automated some of this stuff, let's use the runner functionality of Postman. And I can select that folder that I've been placing my requests in, and I can run all three of those back to back. So now we're kind of getting into kind of a testing phase, right? I can see all of those working, and it says 200 OK on my query, add, and delete, which is great. That's testing to make sure that they kind of worked and they didn't hit a bad endpoint, but maybe we want to do some actual tests, like say we were the ones developing this REST endpoint. Well, Postman has a great testing framework that we can demo real quick. If I switch back to Postman and go back to the test tab where we had set up our environmental variable, I'm also going to add a test. Adding a test is as simple as that. Basically, Postman exposes this test variable where you can place all your tests on. My test is called added successfully, and I'm just making sure that the response body has a string of success true in it anywhere. Super simple test. You can get more complicated in your own code. So let me save that. And now if I switch back to my runner, if I run it again, we've got the same thing, except this time it's showing me that I have one test on that add and that it passed. So super simple example, but you guys can see how you could expand on that, especially if you're writing an API. It's really powerful. One last quick feature of Postman is the code button. For all of us lazy developers, you can basically have an HTTP request and you can generate the code that's going to make that request in a bunch of different languages. So you've got your standard curl, but you've also got pretty much everything. Go, JavaScript, Node.js, PHP, whatever. If you click on one of these, it's going to spit out exactly what code you need to copy into your web application to do that request, which is really great. So that's Postman. You can find it over at, well, just Google for it. I think it's at getpostman.org.
How many people used Fiddler on Windows in the past? So Fiddler doesn't exist. It sort of exists in like an alpha version for Mac. Postman has completely replaced Fiddler and exceeded everything that I used to be able to do in Fiddler using the different tools that Gavin just showed. So even if you're like a hardcore Fiddler user, definitely check it out. So our next group of tools here, we're winding down a little bit, is communication tools. This one's going to be a little bit softer. We cheated a little bit and we had to pick the same thing. So I'm going to kind of just go over the high level stuff, and then Gavin's going to talk about some of the integrations you can do with Slack, right? So Slack kind of made an appearance during plenary, actually. They talked about the spatial community Slack team or organization, which is not created by Esri, but Esri's kind of embraced it as a good place for open collaboration amongst GIS developers and other sort of spatially minded people in the industry. Esri also uses Slack internally. So within professional services, we have an entire Slack team that uses it to collaborate across the organization, but also on individual projects. And I think that's really where the power is. I'm always asked, like, why is Slack better than Skype or Link or some other chat system? And I think that the sort of the seminal thing is these persistent chat rooms. You're not just having these transactional interchanges between you and one other person. You're having a place for information to live, and then people can kind of come and interact with it as they see fit. So it's persistent also. So when a question gets answered in Slack, that answer and question kind of live on forever, right? And so Slack has really good search tools, so you can go back in time and get information out of that Slack channel. Whereas if that's in a program like Skype or even an email, sometimes it's hard to really track back and find that. A really interesting quote that I heard on a podcast recently too is that communication is as important as code on a project. And I think that's really true. So you could write the most kick-ass algorithm or code snippet, but if it doesn't meet the need, or you don't communicate it well, or it doesn't quite fit in with the project, then it's useless, right? And so communicating about the code that you're writing is just as important as the code that you're writing in the first place. And then their tagline is that they reduce email, and actually they do. At Esri, we use these email aliases or sort of listserv type things to ask questions of larger communities. And the traffic in those has like sort of stepped down and down and down as more and more people are using Slack to ask and answer those kinds of questions in a more collaborative and real-time way. So I'm just going to go over 3 of my favorite features of like the core of Slack, and then Gavin's going to talk about some integrations with other systems. So code is kind of a first-class citizen in messaging in Slack, right? And there's 3 ways you can do it. Inline with just wrapping in backticks, like in Markdown. Also like Markdown, if you have 3 backticks around it, then it'll actually let you do a multi-line code snippet. And then sort of the most robust one is what are called snippets in Slack. And with that, you can actually choose syntax as well. So you can see that I've chosen JavaScript/JSON as a syntax, and it's actually highlighting my code for me and adding line numbers, which is really good for communicating about code. Slackbot, I can't even go too deep on this, but just to touch the surface, Slackbot is the sort of the bot that comes with Slack, and it can do lots of different things. 2 of my favorite things are reminders and custom responses. So with reminders, you can just use a / command, which is kind of like the command line interface to Slack, if you will, to ask Slackbot to remind you to do things. I'm pretty infamous for like never filling out my timesheet at Esri, and since I started telling Slackbot to remind me every day to fill out my timesheet, I get less angry emails from HR. And then custom responses, in this example here, we actually do this at Esri as well. We have a guest Wi-Fi network in my office, and anytime anybody asks what the Wi-Fi password is, Slackbot's there to give you the answer right away. And then probably the most used feature of Slack for me is another / command. You just type /shrug, and it gives you this nice little guy, because sometimes there are just no words to answer a question you've been asked.
Cool. So Slack is a great communication tool, as Josh showed, but it really shines when you start using app integrations. So app integrations are ways for other services like your bug tracking system or your code integration server to post messages and interact with your team. The GitHub integration is one of the most popular, if not the most popular. It allows your project team to stay updated on the commits and PRs of what's happening in your GitHub repo. And it's really integral to our professional services projects to make sure that everyone's seeing the progress of what's going on, and you can have discussions around the updates. So let's jump into that real quick. So here's a Slack room that Josh and I have. And basically, we've set up our GitHub integration over here. And if I switch over to my GitHub repo, which is the GitHub repo for this talk, I created this issue. There was a problem with the widget. I'm going to close it now because I just fixed that. Oh, gosh, GitHub, so smart. So I'm going to close that, and you'll see that immediately I got a message notification down here, and GitHub put a note into here. And so yeah, there you go. But Josh is showing there that I think the power of this integration is not that it's just keeping everyone up to date, but that you can have a communication around these things, right? So something closed, Josh commented on it, I could comment it. So it's kind of continuing the discussion that maybe shouldn't happen on GitHub for whatever reason in Slack. So it's really powerful. Another integration that we're not going to do a live demo, but is with your code integration server like Jenkins. We have this on many of our projects. It reports back whenever we do an automated build, if the build succeeded, or if it failed. This is a good example from one of our live chat rooms. The build failed. Our tester, Matt, mentioned here, which is mentioning everybody in the chat room, saying that hey, it failed. Our developer kind of looked into it, Matt looked into it, and then at the very bottom, our developer figured out, kind of what's the issue. So I think this illustrates really well about how an integration with your code integration server can really help keep your code on track, where in the past maybe your build may have been failing for much longer. And also a fun one like Josh's, the GIF keyboard or Jiffy or whatever however you pronounce it, is a really fun integration. Basically, you just say /GIFs and it'll search based on your term and it'll insert in the GIF. And it seems like fluff, but also it's a real practical thing that it helps with team building, especially when I think a lot of us have teams across the country, across the world now. So just a fun one to end on. Slack and Slack apps can be found at slack.com and slack.com/apps. They've got like hundreds of them. You can even build your own. So we encourage you to check that out.
Oops. Sneak peek there. All right, so code editors is our last one here that we're going to talk about. I already showed you, but Atom is my editor of choice. I used to use Sublime Text too, and I've played around with Visual Studio Code as well. Those are what I would consider to be sort of the three current, like, modern web developer-focused editors. But I would also say that if you find yourself using Visual Studio or Eclipse or IntelliJ or something like that, and you like it and it works for you, then go for it. I'm definitely not one to say that you should only use one or the other. But if you are using those, and at the same time you're complaining about, or you find yourself often complaining about how the web is hard because there's no tools and stuff like that, go and look and see what sorts of plugins there are for your editor, because they exist for most of them out there now. So I do use Atom though. It's made by GitHub. It's free. You don't have the annoying dialogue in Sublime Text if you don't pay for it that tells you every day that you should be paying for it. It's open source, which is kind of feel good, but also it means that their release cycle is actually pretty rapid because there are lots of people working on it. My biggest complaint about Sublime Text when I was using it is that the guy who works on Sublime Text also has a day job, and the release cycle is kind of slow and has been getting a little bit better, but it was a challenge for him, I think, to keep up with the demand. So large community, not only for the open source committers, but also for the packages that make Atom so great. There are tons of people who are working on those. I would say that when new packages are created or new concepts for packages are created, if they don't land in Atom first, they land like the next day after they landed in some other editor. And then integration with Git and GitHub. It's built by GitHub, right? So it makes sense, but that's another really good thing that I kind of overlooked at first. I had been using Atom for a long time before I used any of the GitHub features that are built in, but these commands that you can use to look at your code in GitHub have become like an integral part of my workflow since I've discovered them. So for example, the top one is file, right? So this is in the command palette, which Atom and Visual Studio Code and Sublime Text all have with Command-Shift-P or Control-Shift-P. So it's literally like that hotkey combination and then type GitHub file or GitHub blame or whatever you want. And you can open up GitHub with the file being displayed that you're looking at in your editor, but also the line number, right? So if you're editing a line that exists in your master version on GitHub or whatever your default version, your default branch is on GitHub, then you can actually go and look at it in the web browser and collaborate with people that way. You can copy the link, you can do it directly via command or copy it from your browser and send it to someone in Slack or an email and have that like direct link to the line of code that you're talking about, and it's really, really invaluable. Git blame is something that I had never really used before, before I discovered it here. But I was working on a project with Gavin recently, and I was working on a feature that hadn't been touched in over a year, and there had been a lot of churn on the developers who were working on that app, and I found myself like having no clue what to do to like work on this feature. And so a quick like Command-Shift-P blame opened GitHub and told me who worked on it and when they worked on it last, and it was someone who was no longer on the project and had worked on it like a year and a half ago. But it gave me a place to go to figure out sort of who to ask the questions of, right? And then I already mentioned the package community. It's big, and there are lots of really cool packages out there, and Gavin's going to talk about a few of those now.
So we're just going to rapid fire some of these at you. The first, from kind of simple to complex. On the simple side of things, toggle quotes. If you haven't used this, super simple, Control-Shift quote. It'll change from double quotes to single quotes and back. It's great for cleaning up code if you don't have a kind of linter or a formatter built in to your project yet. Minimap is a feature that I believe was started in Sublime Text, and it's also kind of really important to me to get that into Atom. If you haven't used a Minimap before, it's basically on that right-hand side. You can see a mini version of the code, and it helps you get context to this file, and it allows you to zero in on where you want to edit really quickly. Pigments. My GIF is not showing up.
Here, I got it.
Oh, there we go. Of course. So Pigments is a great plugin. Basically, the main thing it does is shows the color of a color code that you have. So you can see here that there's my color code, and it puts it in green in the background. So here's a better example of that. It also does translation, so you can put your cursor on the word green and type in the command palette and have it convert to hex or RGB or something. So that's really useful. You can search for, you can pull up the find colors, which finds all the colors in your project, which really helps me, who I'm not a designer. If I need to find, oh yeah, I want to use that green that we have in our project, but I don't know where to find it, this really helps me find that quickly. Some more complicated plugins, but still useful. Get Time Machine. For a particular file, you can pull up the history of that file. You can see on the bottom with the dots, it's basically a graph of all of the changes that have been made to this file. And you can click on one of those dots to see a diff of this file between when that commit was and the current file. It's really, really useful for code investigation. And finally, Atom Terminal. Basically pulling in a terminal into a bottom panel in Atom. It's really important in web development world now. We're either using Webpack or a task runner like Grunt. You can see your status of your build or your task runner at the bottom. Atom Terminal is really popular. On Windows, I like to have PowerShell, so if you like PowerShell as well, Platform.io IDE Terminal is what I use.
All right, we're skipping the bonus levels, so we don't have time. But we talk about ESLint and Webpack a little bit. If you guys are interested, check out the slides or come up and ask us after the talk, and we'll talk about it with you. So we want to wrap up with sort of calling out this article that came out last year, how it feels to learn JavaScript in 2016. Does anybody remember this? They read it? Did it resonate with you? So it resonated with me, but I also had this like visceral like reaction of like offense. I was like super offended personally by this article as a web developer who loves tools. And I'm like, what do you mean there are too many tools? But again, I get why it was written. And so if you haven't read it, I'm not going to say go read it, but you could go read it just to get some background. But I think the more useful idea about it was Adi Osmani's response article to it, where he also said, you know, I get it, but what really kind of stood out to me was this little quote about learning and keeping up with the JavaScript ecosystem, the idea or the mantra of do it right, and then do it better, right? Don't try to learn all of these tools at once, because you're going to have too many things going on, and you're not going to know when something breaks. You have no idea where to go to figure out what broke, right? When I started learning React, I had to learn React, and I was adopting ESLint from JSHint, and then Webpack, and a few other things, Babel, all at the same time. And it was like the hardest couple weeks of my career, because I couldn't figure out if it was React that was breaking or Webpack that was breaking or whatever was going on. So try to learn one thing at a time when possible. Become comfortable with it, and then add another layer onto your knowledge when it comes to these tools. Gavin and I were talking earlier, and we think that if just one of these sort of things that we rapid fired at you guys becomes like an integral part of your workflow by next year's Dev Summit, then we kind of succeeded, and it was the worthwhile hour. Again, because any one of these things, whether it's DevTools or Postman or someone that you follow on Twitter, if that becomes something that you then use on a daily basis, I think it was an hour well spent. Last thing, as we were putting this together, and based on some feedback that we've gotten in the past, we've heard that this talk is kind of like a dreamland. Like, we're talking about a lot of cool new things, but then you go home and you face reality and clients and like deadlines and all those kinds of things, and legacy code, and you're maintaining this 5-year-old Dojo app that doesn't even use AMD, and there's this like gap between those two things. And so I put together this blog. It was supposed to be one blog post, but it turned into like 7, as well as a project where I migrated the crowdsourced reporter, which is an Esri solutions application, to use a lot of these things that we're talking about. So it uses ES6 modules as well as syntax. It's using Webpack to bundle itself up and doing some more sort of sophisticated things with Webpack, and could do a lot more. I just didn't have time. So this is a series of blogs on GeoNet. There's a link here. Well, also give us a review on this, but there's a link here. Both the top link is to this presentation, and the bottom one is to the first of those blog posts. So go check that out if you think that would be useful for you. And I'll go back now. So please rate the session. Your feedback is really useful. We try to incorporate it every year, and if we don't get any feedback, then we probably won't be back next year anyway. So go do that if you can. That's it. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.